So this will be an analysis of part one of the wreck of the Deutschland. And in this overview and analysis, I'd like to just take you through stanza by stanza. But first, give you an introduction and then an overview. So this, what they call part the first, is divided into three sections. The first 5 stanzas, Hopkins relates his own encounter with God. And then stanzas 6 to 8, he reflects on Christ's suffering. And then in 9 to 10, he ends with a prayer. And the entire part, the first, is unified by the theme, and that is of Christ's mastering of the universe, and in particular his life, Hopkins' life. And he ends with the prayer that Christ will continue to master the universe and change the lives of those in need of change for all of mankind, not just himself. So he walks us through those sections in part one. The theme mastering is found in many of Hopkins' other sonnets. Now, mastering, I'll explain that. It's evident that throughout all of Hopkins' works, there's always a sacramental theme, okay? Whether it's in his terrible sonnets or his nature poetry, the theme of Christ's presence and his instrumentality in subjecting the world to his will is found, echoing the words of St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews. And these are the words. It was not to angels that God subjected the world to come. Someone has testified somewhere, "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him?" And subjecting all things to him, he left nothing not subject to him. Yet at present we do not see all things subject to him, but we do see Jesus crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death. So that's from Hebrews 2 to 5 and 12. Hopkins clearly emphasizes this idea in the closing stanza of his poem entitled "The Lantern Out of Doors," when he describes Christ's watchfulness over mankind. And he sums that poem up saying, "Christ minds, Christ's interest, what to avow or amend, there eyes them, heart wants, care haunts, foot follows kind, their ransom, their rescue, and first, fast, last, friend." So you'd have to go back to that poem to see how that concludes what he proposed in the first part. But it just has that blanketing feeling of Christ's care for all of mankind and guiding us in our paths. So here's an overview of the entirety of part one, part the first, it's called. This theme, mastering, is the underpinning of the ode, The Wreck of the Deutschland. Now, it's an ode because it's written about the 5 nuns who went to their deaths. So it's an ode to them. All right. So the theme here, God subjecting all things, especially man, to his will. That's what the overall theme is of part one. So part the first begins with Hopkins' reflection on God's grace in his own life as he recounts his agony before and after his conversion to Catholicism, and then later when he joined the Jesuit order, and throughout his subsequent battles of depression. And the 6 sonnets are called the Terrible Sonnets, address that depression, and they're covered elsewhere in this blog. In this poem, He holds God in account for his suffering with reference to these dark times by saying he was almost made unmade, what with dread, and he calls it thy, meaning God's doing. So God almost unmade him, because in first part, sonnet, the first stanza rather, talks about how God, gave him flesh and bones and created his body, but he almost undid that through his anguish and suffering that drove him nearly mad. Okay, so that's an overview. In stanza 1, Hopkins begins with his acknowledgement of God's role in his life. He says, "Thou mastering me." Yet, at the same time, he asserts that he was still in control of his own choices. In other words, it wasn't predestination here. He was able to say yes at the lightning and lashed rod, while acknowledging God's power and loving and providential care. He says, "Lord of the living and dead, swayer of the seas and the world's strand, you bound bones and veins in me, fastened me flesh." So here is a God who created the entire universe and then created this small creature of humanity, Hopkins. And he recognizes and acknowledges that and praises God for that. Saying that in that, stanza, that he still had his free will. Okay? God mastered him, but did not take away his choice, Hopkins' choice. So acknowledging that he has felt this presence or mastering throughout his life, he now says that he feels God's finger once again touching him afresh. Okay, so he's implying that God's finger touched him when he changed from Anglicanism in the Church of England to Catholicism, and then again when he joined the Jesuit order, and then he eventually became a priest. So that was God's touching him. And now he says he feels it once again, that he's called to do something. It's a calling, and he's responding, and he's putting it into words. This time he feels the call to write, and it's an ode dedicated to the 5 Franciscan Sisters of the Sacred Heart who were drowned as a result of the folklores, their having been expelled from Germany because of the anti-Catholic laws of that country, the folklores, in that period of time. Now, that's stanza 1. Stanza 2, he gets more specific regarding his own experiences in answering the call to priesthood, as well as his swoon of heart that swept in the hurl of thee trod hard down with a horror of height, suggesting that he was drawn to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. His reference here to thy doing in almost unmaking him recalls a similar treatment of his anguish as related in another poem, Carrying Comfort, when he says that his turmoil was sent so that my chaff might fly, my grain lie sheer and clear. Nay, in all that toil, that coil, sent seems I kiss the rod. In other words, telling us in that poem that he recognized that God sent that anguish into Hopkins' life as a means of purification, separating the wheat from the chaff. And that's brought out in that poem. So he's bringing it up again here in stanza 2, that God played a role, and he touched him during that period of his life. Stanza 3, he admits that he sought escape from the hurdle of hell in terror and dread. Where was the place of refuge that he was seeking? In answer, he says he turned to God. I whirled out wings that means that period of time. I whirled out wings during that period of time and fled with a fling of the heart to the heart of the host. So back here, I spoke about he turned to Catholicism because of its teaching on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And that's why he flung with a heart to the heart of the host, signifying he was drawn to Catholicism because of its teaching on the real presence, as I mentioned in the stanza 3, that he was drawn to Catholicism for that reason, the heart of the host. He had once written that this teaching was the most lovable doctrine of Catholicism in his writings. So now in stanza 4, he acknowledges that God has touched him a second time, and believing it for the purpose of writing this ode to honor these 5 nuns, he has given him a feeling of sustaining peace, which he describes in the form of 2 metaphors. That this peace has come over him in choosing to do this, to write this sonnet. Not a sonnet, to write this ode. And he likens the feeling of peace to 2 things, therefore the metaphors. The first is that of the soft sands sifting through an hourglass, for they are contained within an embrasure, and he feels he is doing God's work incrementally as the sands drop, through the hourglass, not all at one fell swoop, but, over a gradual period of time. And there's a feeling of security, too, in the hourglass image because, it's self-contained within the glass. And he feels like God has, folded his wings, the Holy Spirit, comforting him, keeping him within its wings as a brooding hen, as we saw in some of the other poems. That image came up twice to my recollection. And the second is of the calm water in a well. It's undisturbed and it's mirror-like. He calls it a pane, like a pane of glass, okay? The gentle trickle of the water replenishing the well also is incremental, while the surface of the glass, of the water, remains still and peaceful. He says he is roped with that stream and calls his writing this ode to Christ. He calls his writing this ode Christ's gift to him, the offer of the gospel. So that's found in stanza 4. Now we move on to stanza 5. He begins by blowing a kiss to the stars. And this is another theme that we find in almost all of his poetry where, nature is a manifestation of God's presence. Recognizing God's presence in all of creation. Starlight wafting him, that would be Christ, out of it. The next few lines speak of Christ's presence in the sun, the thunder, and the dappled damson west. Now, damson plum is the color, bluish purple of the setting sun. So that very beautiful image of the sunset, spotted with purple, bluish purple. And here, in stressing God's presence in all of creation. All right, I'm not going to get into in stressing, that's in the other poems. The stanza closes with another common theme of Hopkins, and that is of making evident God's presence, like his duty. He's called to do this in his works, making God's presence evident to people other than himself, all right, and sharing that vision of God's mastering of all things, seen and unseen. His mystery must be stressed, for I greet him the days I meet him, and bless when I understand. So that's what I'm talking about. He feels compelled to share that vision that he has with others, and he does it through his poetry, and in this case, the ode gives him a feeling of peace and comfort because he feels he is doing God's work. The energy which comes from God that holds together a thing's essential quality or individual character must be emphasized. He's saying that the mysteries of God's creation must be made manifest to people other than himself. okay, because he sees it and he wants others to see it as well. And then he says he greets Christ where he finds them in his everyday existence. And he's back here, it says, when I understand. So there's a bit of self-deprecation here in these last three words, because he says he doesn't always understand, okay? He doesn't always get the mysteries of life. But when I do, I share that, okay? So, not important. All right, stanzas 6 to 8. These stanzas meditate on Christ's suffering now, okay, as I said in the overview. Stanza 6 begins by telling us that our perception of Christ's mysteries spring from his passion and death, not from Christ's having come from heaven as the Word of God and the Son of the Father, as spoken by St. John, St. John's Gospel. He would be more, this would more relate to Gospel of Mark and Luke. All right, the stress felt is from Christ's having become human. That is where the stroke that was swung and dealt originates from, not from heaven. So when he's stanza 7 begins with it, and he's talking about that that stress, okay, that we find in the passion and the death of Christ. So it continues this thread saying, it, the stress, dates from the day of his going in Galilee. Now, going in, that means his living, his actions during that period of time of his life, goings, okay? Keeps all his goings, graces, in another poem. You're saying that Christ's suffering, alluded to at the end of stanza 6, originates from his day of his going in Galilee. I just said that. The next few lines give a quick capsule image of Christ's conception, his birth, his infancy, just by a couple of images, a maiden's knee, the child on Mary's knee, and then his passion with the words, the frightful sweat, and then death and resurrection. And when he speaks of the resurrection, here we're talking about the fruits of Christ's redemption, all right, redemption, the swelling of to be, that's the way he puts it in those words. So the swelling signifies the fruits of his suffering and death and our redemption. All right, that's 7. So stanza 8 is a commentary about our feelings when confronted with extreme emotion, saying that we express ourselves with the most positive or negative words depending on the intensity of the situation. I'm not entirely satisfied with this interpretation that I create here, but I think that's what he's saying. And when he says, we lash with the best or the worst word last, I think that, other people besides him, like we, all together experience, whether, the people are the best of mankind or the worst of mankind, I don't know, I might be wrong, but we all experience our ups and our downs. And there are times in our lives when we turn to the word as the last. Remember in the other poem, first, fast, last, speaking that, the word of God is whom we turn to as our last. I think that's what that means, okay? Hopkins is saying, but I make it sound as though it's emphatic here. Hopkins is saying that our language can be incredibly powerful or incapable of full expression, depending on the circumstances. He refers now to his own pitiful and anguished encounter with God, again recalling an image from the Carrying Comfort poem when he addressed God in these words, O thou terrible, why wouldst thou scan me with darksome, devouring eyes, my bruised bones? Remember, he called himself a heap on the floor, and he was like all huddled, looking up at this, almost monster of God, hovering over him. And where can I escape to? So that image comes through here in this stanza when he speaks of his own escape, saying that he turned as countless others might in a time of this tumult and, riotous kind of feeling within oneself, by turning to Christ's feet, never asking if he needed it, wanted it, or warned of it. Men go, that line. So that goes back to what I'm saying. We lash with the best and the worst. Word last, first, last, always Christ. So we turn to Christ. Now, this is the only time I'm talking about his prosody. I'm talking in these poems, analyses that I do. I focus on the meaning, not so much the structure. Okay, that goes. You can go elsewhere to find that because it's there. But the point is that it's there, and occasionally I'll bring it out because there's one little piece in this stanza that I want to focus on, and it's kind of unique. All right, but I'll get to it in a second. He says that men rush to Christ in a flash. Okay, to Christ's feet go. This is described as a rather unique use of syntax by placing the comma, this is what I'm talking about, before the apostrophe. He has apostrophe S, but he has comma apostrophe S. And that implies two meanings. The full line reads, to hero of cavalry, comma, Christ, all right, then comma, then apostrophe, then S, feet. So what he does is, with the use of the comma, he makes Christ, that one word, the appositive, the hero. So Christ is the hero of cavalry. All right. Now, once we have that, then he says to Christ's feet, which means that it's the feet of Christ. So that little construction there, comma apostrophe S, is rather unique. Okay. He makes the positive of Christ, which says that Christ is the hero, and the use of the apostrophe for his feet indicates that men rush to the feet of Christ. All right, so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about where, he uses unique prosody there, okay, syntax. All right, now, stanzas 9 and 10. Stanza 9 begins with a prayer reflective of the Lord's Prayer, expressing the sentiment, hallowed be thy name, in the words, be adored among men. Okay, that's how it begins. The next few lines address the animal and man's nature, saying that man's malice is the rebel dogged within, meaning his rebellious spirit is dogged, persistent and stubborn within us. But also, dog is in a den, okay? Ring thy rebel dogged in den, suggesting that the rebel is staying in his private little den, trying to avoid God. So that's a cute little way of expressing that idea. To avoid God, he hides in his little den, as the image again comes of Hopkins huddled on the floor, afraid, looking up at God, as the kind of a monster. And it's the rebel that brings on wrecking and storm, whether it is physical or psychological in one's life. That rebellious spirit, okay, not having peace, not finding comfort, not being happy or satisfied with one's state of being. Now, stanzas 9 and 10 begin and end with a prayer to the Trinity, be adored, and it ends with these words, be adored King. Those are the closing words. But 9 begins with be adored, Holy Trinity, and then 10 ends with be adored King. So the rest of the contents speaks of the twofold nature of God and his relationship with mankind through a series of paradoxical descriptive words and phrases, lightning and love, father and fondler, okay? So it can be, the rod and, the tenderness of his heart. A winter and a warm, a dark, descending, and the most merciful. Okay, so dark descending, there's that image again of him on the floor, and his descending of God upon him with his finger, So part N, the first, ends with the same theme of God's mastering of us. Hopkins calls upon God to master him still, make mercy in all of us, out of us all, mastery. And that's rather unique, as I'll show you. Using the metaphor of God as a blacksmith at the anvil, he's forging the will of man to melt him to his will, like the metal. You heat the metal and then you shape it. So shaping our will to God, and God's responsible for that, and the image is that of a blacksmith doing it, okay? So Hopkins cites other examples of God's fingering others, touching them, and changing their lives with allusions to St. Paul on the road to Damascus and St. Augustine. He calls them Austin. He does that for the number of syllables in that word. He abbreviates the word Augustine. Influenced by the sermons of St. Ambrose, that was over a long period of time. If you read the Confessions of Augustine. So it wasn't sudden. St. Monica found out, her continuous praying. So one is sudden, like Paul, whether he's on a horse or whatever, he fell to the ground, he lost his sight, he was speechless, and then that was a sudden thing. And then the gradual conversion of St. Augustine. So here, Hopkins is saying, master us all, whether it is fast or gradual. So, and remember that incremental thing, like the image of spring coming with the flowering of buds over a long period of time before, it's fully flourishing. That's what happened in his life, okay? So he concludes saying this. So whether at a sudden crash or meltingly, as we experience the coming of spring, Hopkins petitions God to master all of mankind, not just himself, ending his part, the first, with these beautiful lines: make mercy in all of us, out of us all, mastery. But, and then the closing, be adored, King. So by returning to the same word, mastery, and to the same theme from the opening line of stanza 1 to the closing line at the end of part the first, he establishes a perfect unity. Moreover, he evolves from the focus of mastering from himself in stanza 1 to the mastering of the whole human race in stanza 10. So that is what part the first does, and that's his purpose for it. And then we'll move on to part 2 after I do my analysis, which I haven't started yet.